Hey guys, welcome back to MozFest 2019, the 10th anniversary. Also, this month is London Black History Month, which is awesome. So unfortunately, Francesca Bria was going to give a talk, but she no longer can make it. But you should still check out her project Decode online. Instead, we have a panel for you today called Great Code, Great Responsibility, including Kathy Pham and Bitange Ndemo. So if you guys want to come on stage right now, you guys can give them applause. Thanks for joining me.
Of course.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
I'm just playing around. Okay, so just to introduce these guys. Kathy previously worked at Google on the Google Health team. She also worked at the White House United States Digital Service. Currently, though, she's at Harvard's Kennedy School, where she teaches a course on product management and society. She's definitely qualified to talk about Great Code, Great Responsibility. She's also a Mozilla Fellow. And Ndemo is a professor of entrepreneurship at University of Nairobi. He's also chairman of Distributed Ledgers and AI. He's also senior advisor to the UN, and he has a lot other credentials, but he told me don't even list them all because it's too many to name. So I'll stop it right there. But yeah, I want to talk to you guys about the infamous Spider-Man quote, great code, great responsibility. And I think just to kick it off, when we talk about what's wrong on the internet today, whether it be misinformation, tracking, biased algorithms, some people suggest like policy fixes and laws. What do you guys advocate for? How do we go about kind of fixing some of these things? Anyone can start, by the way.
Yes, it's actually very difficult to say that policymakers alone can just sit down and do that. I used to be in policymaking, and the way we did it was to enable innovation to take place, and then we can look at which areas we can put some regulations. Even now, as we work through AI and these other emerging technologies, we're looking at how can we have legal sandboxes and build something. Because what has happened when GDPR went through in Europe, African governments began to shut down the internet by putting laws like or taxes on social media and completely stifling innovation. So there is a huge balance that we need to balance between innovation and the policy making in this space. I've always said that religion would be so boring if there wasn't Satan. So a little bad is good.
A little bad is good. Wow.
Yes.
You're on the panel called Great Code, Great.
Yeah.
So Kathy, do you want to talk about the question for it as well?
I think it's an ecosystem, right? We need the policymakers, we need the developers, we need leadership, we need the individual contributors. I'm going to circle back to the policy piece at the end. I think of one, the code we write now affect products that are deeply rooted in all of our lives. We can't just say we build technology and maybe it impacts society. It's all the technology, the code we write impact all parts of society, whether it goes in the airplanes that took you here to this event, or the platforms that give you the information that we read, a number of places. And I think that's where, as a computer scientist, when we write code, there's a lot of responsibility there, recognizing how it's used, but also, I always go back to, there's this book that a lot of people who study computer science or software engineers read. I hate the title, but it's called The Mythical Man Month. And part of that, there's a whole section there on why people get into software because we like having a very malleable medium. So like a not malleable medium is like a foundation for a house. When you set the foundation, it's really hard to change the foundation. But with code, you can change a variable. You can change something in your code to say, if number of prison sentences is greater than 5, do this pretty quickly and deploy the code out, and it can change, especially in the world with like cloud computing, et cetera. And so there's a lot of responsibility there because we work in a medium that's really easy to change and really quickly to change. And when you can write code and have it in front of people and in front of groups pretty readily. And so there's so much responsibility there of to think about how that happens. And I think on the regulation piece, we need people there also to help us think about when we don't write our code well or impact societies in ways that we don't understand. There are other safeguards there, but at least in the United States, we don't have people in those positions who can make those policies very well.
Yeah, I mean, I think about computer science education in the classroom level, and you guys both have worked in the classroom extensively. What are some things that computer science education is getting right and also getting wrong?
Well, you can't say that we have a responsibility to inculcate culture in students at university level. I always say that culture, ethics is actually culture. I mean, where you grew up and how you are brought up. So we all have responsibility as parents before you even talk at university level. Of course, the universities and corporates have a responsibility also in the sense that they can build an ethical culture within that space, and people begin to understand the role of ethics in an organization.
Yeah. So part of Mozilla, we fund something called the Responsible Computer Science Challenge. Can you raise your hand in the room if you are part of that? And then raise your hand if you're not part of that, but you also teach ethics or responsibility in computing in some form or passion. Because we have some folks there
people.
as well. Yeah, it's, and you mean you're talking about education specifically. I think 100% culture. We have this culture, I think, where at least in university we kind of separate out. You come to university, you pick a field, you study computer science or social science or anthropology or philosophy or something else, and you go in your lane and you go do that really, really well. And I think how I've seen that manifest is now you have people who perhaps can scale a system and write really efficient code without much consideration for the societal impacts or how it impacts like the long history of race in the world, et cetera. And I think that's where we do have a shortcoming because we put people into lanes and not all universities do that, but many do put people into lanes and we develop this culture. And then within those lanes, we have hierarchies. There are majors that are viewed as, quote, smarter or better than other majors. Sometimes that's because when you graduate, you're paid significantly more. And now you have a hierarchy of majors with people who've now been put into their lanes, and that translates into a culture in the tech industry where you have engineering versus non-engineering, which is how some people are labeled in companies, which is so problematic, or software engineering versus support at other big tech companies. And I think the culture piece is a really big part of it. And where I do think maybe there's a sliver of hope, there are a good number of people who go into technology field because they do want to change the world, and perhaps the definition of what changing the world means, we can think about how to shift that.
Yeah, I want to hit on a few things you just mentioned, because you mentioned how malleable code can be. You're basically playing God when you're making certain products. And then you also have people on the outside telling you, you're the chosen one, you're the smartest person here, take the six-figure salary, like you're the person. And you also mentioned the ways that race kind of can play into it. I know only from my own experience in journalism, there's not a lot of black people in newsrooms that I've been in. So in a sense, I feel a little humbled by my own background, and I'd imagine that's possibly true in tech. Could you speak to the effect of on the one side people telling you you're the chosen one, you're the most important person here, but on the other side knowing that's who you are and your makeup kind of makes you never feel like you're as important as you should feel. Does that ever have an effect on the things you make? What kind of effect does that have at all?
I feel like that's such a heavy reflection of my life and career.
In 60 seconds, you have to answer all of that.
Yeah. You mean me specifically, or the field of CS being told that it's the chosen one?
A little bit of both. Yeah.
So I think if it's just personal reflection, it's, when you study, at least in my university, when you study computer science, we had a prep meeting, we were talking about how it's oh, you study computer science or engineering, you must be really, really smart. Or if that person studied business, no wonder they have time to go out on the weekends to the football games. And it's such a reduced, ridiculous framing of things that's not even true, and that's not how the world works. But you're kind of told this over and over and over again. And then you go into a company that carries on. And And the second part of your question was how, what's the second part of that?
Well, I was asking, how this idea that, you have this inflated ego, but then you're a little humbled by the fact that you're not like hot shit. I don't know if I can say that, but just like the duality of that versus like if someone doesn't have that, what kinds of products do they create? How does it affect, what they make?
I think I paused there because I felt like I don't know if I ever had the inflated ego. It's like you're told that, and I think because I came from a family of refugees to the country, it was always for me like, ooh, this might mean I can just now get a job that is like a normal American job that can support my family. Yeah. And I don't know if that sense of inflated ego was there. It was more we're told this field is really, really great, and now I can use these skill sets since it seems like it's a really valuable skill set in the tech industry.
Yeah, and then Ndemo, anything you want to add? Like, how cocky are your students? Are they like telling you the answers, like, no, you're wrong? Like have you seen any of that in students at your school? Have you seen that at all in your areas?
It always the world humbles you, no matter what you've studied. I mean, where you come from. But when you come to the real world, you find that things are completely different from what you thought they would be. And that's what I can say with my students.
Yeah.
Actually, I just thought of something that I do think the sense of humility does come in when you're like, oh, you're told that these skill sets are the most important skills that you need. Everyone should learn how to code. Not me. Like everyone should learn how to code. These are the skill sets that are the highest paying, the most important. And then getting to collaborate with the social scientists and the race and gender scholars and the people who've studied genocide in the world for decades, and having them really surface what your technology could do in a region when you never thought about those consequences before become really incredibly powerful, and really gets one thinking about, oh my gosh, how do we change the culture of our company such that these kinds of conversations are really normal and make it into all the product development and design.
But if you see the code schools that we are having now, which are non-traditional, I mean, the students who didn't go to college to do code, some of them have become so good that they humble those who have gone through the normal processes, meaning that code isn't what people used to think, that you have to go to Harvard or some other place or MIT to get it. I know some of the best coders who never went to college, but they do the work.
Yeah, same. I want to talk about something you mentioned earlier, and it's something we talked about when I saw you yesterday. You mentioned at the top that there's always like a little bit of evil out there, and the people who kind of make these things. But then, in contrast to that, you've talked about before. If you're working at a tech company, you may not always know the giant products you're working on. You may just kind of be following orders. I want to talk about the duality of good versus evil, not in the superhero sense, but in the sense of people who want to do good, people who want to do evil. I don't know if they exist. And then also the idea that if you're working at a tech company, you may not even know what you're producing until the whole puzzle is formed in front of you. Do you guys want to talk about that a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I said yesterday that, and I said it in the introduction, that some evil is good, in the sense that the people who hack and then show you that you did nothing help you to build a better product. And in code, I think it's good that we continue to have problems, because in entrepreneurship we say the best opportunity is the greatest problem. Get the problem, solve it, and move forward. Without having those problems, you wouldn't have the whole industry of security. And that's why I say that you have created a whole cybersecurity industry because of fear that someone would break through and be able to do evil. So sometimes it plays a big role in terms of improving our product.
Yeah.
There's so many layers to this to me, and I think it's important to have the developers or the people just in companies that be trained for us to think critically and ask questions, because there's so many layers. So there's, for me, the good and evil, but then what if there's a group of people who generally believe we're doing good? but our training has just been in such a way where we don't recognize when we're doing evil. And so you're like, so that's a different kind of theory of change where like these people are already thinking they're doing good and they want to, but they're just not, versus the people that are like, I only care about making money, I only care about the technical aspects, I don't care about anything else, I only want to scale the system to be the fastest system that I can possibly build. And that's like a different kind of group as well. And they may be doing evil too, but like it's because they don't care about society issues and you need to. And they're like the, code is neutral base. And then you also have people, you mentioned, sometimes you're building something, but you don't know the big picture until later. And that's also complicated. You have different size companies, like small tech companies where you actually know what's going on. Then you have the much bigger companies where, for example, most single people don't know how all of Google search works, for example. It's like the Coca-Cola recipe, you just don't really know. So there's different layers of that too. And one last thing is there's a book now called IBM and the Holocaust that many people now know. And there's like a different lens there where we often talk about like consumer type companies or ones that create products that go directly to you. There are also these business to business companies where they develop products and it's sold to a certain entity. We're seeing that now, right, with the US government, or not just the US, but companies build technologies that get sold to governments, and we have to figure out what that means for all of us. And that's a different kind of control, because like you built something, and now it's sold, and depending on who it's sold to, it's used in different ways. So there's just lots of layers.
Yeah. I mean, one thing you were mentioning before, code is neutral. And Ndemo, yesterday you were telling me about this hand dryer, which only recognized white hands, which seems like a huge oversight when it's put out into the world. But I guess the people making it didn't do it on purpose; it just kind of never came up. Is that an area where code is neutral, or is that an area where it's just
everywhere there is bias. Even in this room, there is bias, and when we create code, we should know that there is bias. Perhaps the person who did the machine learning for the dryer did it inadvertently or deliberately, that it was only going to dry white hands, or the person had white hands, and that's what they used to train it. So I would say bias is all over the place. And the best thing on this subject is actually we create more awareness so that you actually know that there is bias and correct the bias.
I think that's actually a great point, too. Creating a culture, I don't think we have this yet, where this exists in the technical side of the house, where the moment you recognize a problem, there's an entire like DevOps or SRE team at tech companies to recognize a problem and like they swarm on it and you reverse the problem. Like for the most part, most of the platforms you're on don't usually go down, but people are hacking it all the time. But it's because there's a whole team that will swarm on it to turn around and write a whole postmortem on it, and they fix it, and we don't even have that. We don't really have that yet for more societal kind of issues. And then on like the bias, he's bringing it down to the code level. I was having a conversation a few weeks ago with folks of when you're writing code, let's say you make decisions like, I'm going to make gender just like a Boolean field, which is like a binary on or off field, because that's what I view it as, and like later on it's much harder to change because you're like, well, gender's only two things. Or like, what if your field, like your array for like skin tones is like 4, you just make it like the length of 4 or something. Because like that's what you think, and then like later on you don't really think to change it, and now you have your ability to recognize like 4 levels of skin tones or something. And so like there are all these decisions. I think that's where for me great code, great responsibility, where you're making all these small decisions when you're writing the code that ultimately affect a really, really big picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that Boolean true-false example is a great one. And you were mentioning before, or you were mentioning before, Kathy, about the swarms of team who will parachute in to fix the problem. Like, I think about the time where Google had that search. They've had a few search mistakes, but one was like, my car was stolen by white people, and then the suggestion was, did you mean your car was stolen by black people? And it's just definitely an oversight. No one did it on purpose, but they quickly changed that because it's super racist.
Yep.
But can you think of any times where something was blatant, but no one swooped in quickly to solve it?
I mean,
sorry to put you on. I was putting you on the spot, but
in general, I feel like that happens like, all the time.
Yeah.
So even like on the platform companies or just in general.
Yeah, like tech products or platform companies. I think like the hand dryer example is just like, okay, that's clearly like I almost have trouble seeing someone's like racing to fix it because it feels like sometimes AI problems like that. Some people don't want to admit that they had biases there.
I'm going to do a spin on your question, which is I think there are some things, let's just take platform companies, for example, that have been really blatant for certain communities. Let's say bullying on Twitter, for example. And it's blatant to some communities, and it took it affecting a much bigger community, or maybe like a more privileged community, for the company to pay attention. So I think the blatant question is sometimes, yeah, there are people who have been affected by it for a long time, but it took some kind of uproar, it took people really pointing it out, or even like someone's op-ed to really get the company to pay attention. And sometimes it also takes affecting the privileged population before they're, whereas you're like, people, we've been affected by this for years, and now you're paying attention.
Yeah, and then another thing I want to get back to with the hand dryer, because it's just so crazy to me. One thing we talked about in the last panel, and something I think about a lot, is this idea that we're just doomed to repeat the same problems over and over again with new toys. So, in the 50s, United States, Jim Crow laws meant, black people couldn't use this certain bathroom, this certain water fountain, this certain hand dryer. And then now it seems like that problem has resurfaced, not because there's a law that says it, but because the tech says no. Are we just doomed to repeat our problems forever with like, regardless of what technology, what laws, everything? Are we just doomed to repeat these problems forever? It's a pretty heavy question.
I think it's a challenge that we must constantly build capacity to notice such things and correct them. Whereas in the past it was more obvious that you could see code has changed it, and that's why I keep on saying that we must build substantial capacity to be able to know that there is bias here and we can correct it.
Since you mentioned Jim Crow, I'm going to call out Dr. Ruha Benjamin and her new, she has framed the term the new Jim Code. So for us, as we think about race and technology and how technology and code affect race, I don't have a good answer beyond, in many ways, code can just amplify society, and we just have to recognize that as we write code versus I'll just put my blinders on and write code, and like however society uses it, so be it. I don't think that code can't change society either. I think it can as well, but it also amplifies it, and just this recognition when we write code to know that we should take all of that into consideration.
Yeah.
There are actually a lot of code, especially in recruitment, where the recruitment completely ignores women or gives them different whatever, or in several ways. The same problems we have in society have been transferred into code. And the most important thing is that before a company uses the code for recruitment, it must be vetted to ensure that all the issues, gender, whatnot, is taken care of. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This will be the last question, and this is actually kind of looking to a future panel that we'll have tomorrow. But should it be on the government to do the vetting, or should it be on the company to do the vetting, or both, or like a third party separate from them?
I worked for government, and I wouldn't give it to government, because government is... there is what we call multi-stakeholder arrangements, where you bring multiple people to come and look at something. Government would smile and use it for other purposes, which are more complex than I can say here now.
Yeah, all of us, right? I think it's government and it's tech companies and it's different levels in the tech company. On the government side, I go back to we don't have the people in government, the same people who are building the technologies. There's not the same level of skill set of understanding of the technology in government to regulate with the type of nuance I think that's needed. And then in addition to regulation, how the laws and policies are enforced, I think is actually the much more important part, where you might have a policy out there, but how it's actually enforced, we need the people around who can do that. And people who make meaningful policies and have it make sense, not just like some new line in a law somewhere that's like, AI cannot be biased. And you're like, what does that even mean? And understand the nuance of what that is so you can really enforce that. Plus, we also can't just wait for people. And even if let's say they regulate us, where's the skill set to understand like how you fix your product, right? So we also need the people in the companies to understand how to build more responsible, better products through some version of internal regulation, top up, bottom down, users, everyone in the ecosystem.
And you used to work in government too, so you both are saying, I worked in government, not government. Just give it to the people.
Oh, no, definitely. I didn't say not government.
Oh, okay.
I 100% think government has a role in this. I think regulation has a goal in this. Whether or not people are pro or against GDPR and how effective it is, it's there, and it sends us, at the very least, it sends a signal that there's a thing that requires you to be a little bit more responsible, or at least like let me know that cookies are on my site. Like I think there's at least like it's a starting point. I think government 100% has a role, and can be very powerful. I think just one of the shortcomings is we just don't always have the tech skill sets, and that's something governments across the world are grappling with. My capacity in government was more just in the United States. We built the United States Digital Service. People had been thinking about bringing tech skills into government for years. And then 1 year, healthcare.gov failed, and that was kind of like an impetus to bring more technologies in government. And it was, folks came in to specifically work on social service issues, but because people were in the room, they were asked to advise on things with policy and like executive orders and different things like that. So I 100% think government has a role in this.
Okay,
We just need the skill set.
I say in the fullness of time, technology finds solutions to problems. If you see fake media, there are emerging softwares which would actually tell you that this is fake media. When we go for policy to correct problems in technology, it usually happens too early before the whole development is done, and out of frustration that, oh, this is happening, even in places where we are the problem. If you look at what is available online, it's something that we have put there voluntarily, and not what has been collected by the government or some of the companies. So we are our worst enemies when it comes to online. But whenever there is something that requires correction, I think it gives a challenge that another company would come and create a solution out of it. And it usually happens, but when we go for policy, we kill the whole thing.
Got it. All right, well, that's all questions for me. If the audience has any Q&A questions, oh, sure, right there. I think we have a microphone. It's coming to you right now. Oh.
Hi, I love the idea of infusing ethics into code, but I'm wondering also if there should be some kind of partnership between the people who set the user requirements and the strategic direction of either the function or the enterprise, which then means, to me, you have to infuse ethics across all disciplines that ultimately affect code. How do you guys feel about doing something like that, infusing it across all disciplines?
We are actually seeing a lot more collaborations, a lot more people talking about multi-stakeholder approach to developing some solutions. And I think that is what would be more effective than the current processes that we are doing.
I think that there's work in that space now where it's, yes, to infusing ethics and responsibility across all disciplines, and yes, to giving other disciplines that are not computer science disciplines some level of understanding of computer science or code, such that when they're thinking about law issues or human rights issues, there's also an understanding of how code fits into that. I think is also really important. And I think also back to like how we're all in our own lanes, some of the ethics conversations, I think, for me, are also just social and race and justice conversations, and not ethics in maybe the traditional like philosophy sense. So even just bringing the people who study those things together with the tech people, that kind of is like thinking about tech in like an ethical way, even without those words. And so, yes, in agreement to everything you said.
Okay. Interdiscipline.
Yes.
Hello. I've been thinking a lot about unions lately. Do you think that
About
some
what?
sort
I'm
of
sorry.
unions,
Unions.
labor unions, tech labor unions, do you think that something like that could play a role in providing a check and balance in ethics?
Yeah, go for it.
Actually, yes, it's important. I was watching the US debate, and I think it's Elizabeth Warren who brought the issue and says she's going to have responsible capitalism where the unions would be part of the board. That would be very key in the sense that when they introduce like a recruitment software, the unions would vet and see what biases does it have and then correct it before it is used. I think it's important that we take that from responsible capitalism to responsible code and provide some solutions that fit.
Yeah, I think unions are very powerful. We're seeing now employees speaking up, tech workers coalition, et cetera. I also think it's important that the unions are not just like the software engineers that work in the companies, that they're all the people who are part of the entire tech ecosystem that make tech happen. So if you're only looking at, let's say, the ride-sharing companies, it's all the people who make tech happen, whether it's content and content like all those people that make tech happen, and that it's not just maybe perhaps the privileged folks in the unions and the dynamics that can come out of that. There's so much more that we probably should talk more about after this, but there's a lot to I think about there too.
I think the term is interdisciplinary, where everybody, a social scientist would ask a psychologist, would ask a tech person. That approach would solve the problems.
Any other questions out there?
This will be our last one.
I wanted to ask maybe a bit of a weird spin in where bias in technology or trained algorithms. Could you not also look at them as great mechanisms to surface formerly invisible types of discrimination? I've seen examples where, for instance, in recruitment, all of a sudden, because this became visible through technology, society more broadly became aware, wow, this is actually an evidence base for discrimination happening. Could you also not see that as a positive kind of signaling pattern recognition type role?
Yeah. You mean like by design it was biased, so therefore now the company is like, oh wow, look at this algorithm that was poorly designed, but it surfaced an issue, or that we should use it to surface issues?
Yeah, I guess, if out of training data discriminatory patterns emerge, that's kind of a signaling role. So maybe you should think about what kind of correcting mechanism should we have once you identify that. Because else you may not have seen that ingrained discrimination that was there, but what was never signaled.
Actually, it's good. I would say in my country, there used to be statistics that we have taken care of gender. But if you look at the gender that has been taken care of, there are T-girls and other things, so the percentage doesn't, so what they're talking doesn't involve, you don't see it at the top. It's only recently that people began to question, what do you mean by gender? So some definitions ought to be expounded so that you understand that when you're talking a gender balance, it must balance all the way and not at the bottom, then you apply it lying with statistics. And I think, yes, it is important that we are able to decipher some of the practices that happen without us knowing that they used to happen before.
I think this is such an interesting. So I spent, for fun, I spent a year and a half on Google's hiring team because I really wanted to know how hiring worked. And I think to some extent, yes, even AI aside, you can do really simple data analysis and you're like, wow, we pulled some data from our database and last year we hired 3 women and 800 men or something. And that's not a real number. No. But to something that surface data points, right? And I think the added layer of if you're using that as a data point, great. But then if now you're having automated decision making around it without care for that actual bias, so I think in one hand, if it surfaces it and you use it for something, let's talk about how you're using it. But then if your system surfaces some kind of bias and all it does is feed it into some system that determines if someone gets social benefits or someone gets released from prison, for example, without that level of understanding that there is even bias, it gets really, really dangerous. So I think maybe to answer your question, adding the layer of automated decision making to it is where it can get really gnarly versus just, here's some data, I've surfaced some data for you, go and analyze it and figure out your system. I think the automated decision part is where it can get really dangerous.
Nice. Okay, I think that's all from this panel. Thank you, Kathy and Ndemo, for joining me today. Come back at 3:15 for the next talk and panel. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.